Okay, everybody, right. So, episode 2 of In the MiddleMen. So, just to recap who we are, my name's John. We've got Lewis and Trevor, 2 Englishmen and 1 American. So, last week we really just did an introduction of ourselves, just talking about a bit of our history and how we ended up in China. Talked a bit more about expats and the kind of expats that find their way into China and how that's kind of changing these days. So our plan is to really get into some nitty gritty. There's a lot of talk about China, but we've got 25 years between us, and so we really want to address some hot topics. I'm sure most people know that censorship is a big topic when it comes to China. And the truth is, there is massive censorship out there. Some of it's more subtle, I think, than people realize. And maybe we need to ask the question whether censorship can be a good thing, especially when we compare it coming back to our home countries and looking at the difference. So, I don't know, Trevor, do you want to start? What's your kind of experience with censorship in China? Is it very noticeable, do you think?
It's real, and it has a spectrum. And then there's a lot of consequences of which we can talk about of censorship that drastically impacts more than the actual censorship itself, regarding media and
there's knock-on effects, right? There's always these, whenever you kind of meddle with anything, there's always these knock-on effects that kind of go further down the line.
Right.
What was your first experience? Can you remember your first experience with censorship, or when you kind of like went, "Wow, okay, that's pretty real. Now I get it."
This question's for me. Well, yeah, it was very real. It was within my first year of living in China, and as you know, I was very involved in sports and soccer, and I started writing for several blogs, several newspapers, and magazines, some of which were provincial or even regional in the Zhangzhihu, which is the Yangtze River Delta area. And it was all in English, but it was actually through a state media. So it was through the Zhejiang Media Group. And I had written a bunch of stories about Chinese soccer, as well as international soccer with a Chinese spin on it. And then in 2012, so I started writing in 2009, but by 2011, I wrote an article about the optimistic future of Chinese football, which at that point, Chinese football was, if you can imagine it, worse than it is now. And the reason I was optimistic about it is that people in the soccer community knew that the likely candidate to win the, let's say, election of 2013 within the Chinese political system would be Xi Jinping. And that he already had said he had 3 dreams in his life. The first dream was, and he said this to the state media as well, was he dreamed that China could get back into the World Cup. He dreamed that China national football team, China could host a FIFA World Cup, and that 3, China could win the World Cup, all within his life. Yeah. And that entire section that I included was removed and published without me even knowing. So it came to the print of the magazine. I read it, and this entire part had been removed. And I asked, what about it? And they said, it's sensitive. You can't talk about potential likely presidential candidates. And I said, well, could we change? I said, well, we could have negotiated and said, well, there's this person in this position. What was the vice premier or something like that? And they said, no, it's better you just don't talk about this in any article of any politician, and you can't include any image of the politician either, which was quite shocking, the unilateral decision that was made towards that. And that was my first real experience with the Chinese censorship machine, so to speak, and it's quite It's quite abrasive, it's quite sudden, and it's quite it's not a gray line.
Yeah, it's very, very clinical, right? And it happens very quickly. It's quite impressive, actually. And it's kind of, especially when it comes to certain figures and it's directly about politics, the wheels of the machine are found turned quite quickly there. Things get removed, all of a sudden. Have you any more to add to that, Trevor, or shall we? I'm going to ask Lewis the same question.
There's more anecdotes, but I'd like to hear what John you have to say, and as Lewis you as well.
Okay, Lewis, you hit us then with your stories.
Well, I mean that's the first time I've heard that story, Trevor. But I think that doesn't surprise me. It would have surprised me maybe the first couple of years I was in China. But I think very quickly after you've been in China a while, you start to expect that kind of thing. It doesn't surprise you anymore. And I think for most Chinese people, that would just be common sense for them, I guess. Like, well, of course you got cut out if you mentioned a potential political candidate. But yeah, I guess my experience with censorship is just more like the common online sort of censorship experience that you get when you arrive in China, and the social media sites that you're used to back home aren't working. You can't get on YouTube. And for me, actually, I just found it quite liberating. I went to China to learn Chinese, and I was kind of forced to divorce myself from English media, largely, and that kind of it sort of pushed me to actually just spend more time in sort of immersed by Chinese language.
Yeah, you get pushed in that, and I think most people are aware that there's the great firewall in China, as they say now. But when you're actually there and you think, well, it's not going to affect me that much. If you are trying to reach back to your old life, so to speak, and you don't have a VPN, I suppose we can talk a bit more about the technology kind of things a bit later on, but yeah, it can be a bit of a shock. You cannot access a hell of a lot of the internet. I think there are there's three internets in the world. You've got the worldwide internet, you have the Chinese internet, and then you have the North Korean internet. And I think other countries may be looking to. Russia also are putting up their own firewalls, and I think Turkey and Iran are. But I mean, it's nothing compared to China, and it's very efficient. I mean, things get taken down quickly and get blocked very quickly. We talk a bit more about their justifications, I think, why they do this in a moment, and also we won't talk about the other side of this, which is the propaganda, because I think that's a whole nother topic, really. I would say my first experience, I'm going to just kind of give an anecdote of really what most people would expect when they come to China. Lewis, me and you worked at the same, well, we can name the company because the company's kind of gone bust, Webby International. So it was actually a huge company in China, particularly teaching, largely focused on the adult market, teaching anything from businessmen to bored housewives to university students. It was a very successful company at one point, bit mismanaged, went down the dogs, so to speak. But anyway, I actually went to the trouble of reading my contract. And I think, Trevor, I met you quite very early on, and I told you about this contract. And you said to me the immortal word saying, you might as well tear up that contract because it's got about as much value as toilet paper, or words to that effect anyway. And now I get why. But anyway, in that contract, there's one stipulation that stuck in my mind, and it said, you can have free reign in a certain amount of your lessons, because we used to do something called English social corners, which are very popular for English teachers out there. You can pretty much choose any subject and do like a 1-hour presentation or lesson on it.
Any subject?
Well, pretty much. Well, this is it. Not any subject, it turns out, because the one thing in your contract, you're forbidden to mention the 3 T's, it was called. So the 3 T's were Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen Square. Now that was actually in the contract. Did you ever notice that, Lewis?
It's funny that you should say that, because I didn't notice it. But I've been sort of prepped on that before I went to China anyway. But apparently there was a teacher who actually did do, what do they call it, like an English corner kind of thing on talking about one of those. I can't remember which one it was, but actually, and I was really shocked because they apparently he actually did a lesson talking about one of them. It might have been Tiananmen Square.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I actually did touch on some of these subjects. Once you've been there a while, you kind of get to and I was always quite objective, about it. But we, in some lessons, we discussed certain things. I think kind of we avoided Tiananmen Square because that's really the hot topic. But there are lots of things you can talk about with Taiwan and, history of Tibet. And actually, when you look at the history of Tibet, there are some good justifications actually why China is there and should stay there. So we had kind of
that's another.
Yeah, that's another one. But yeah, I mean, I was quite surprised. I kind of thought it was a bit funny, but then I thought, all right, this is kind of real. And I was also told actually that in many of the training centers, that occasionally they have, shall we say, spies or bogus students who are.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, it is true. Yeah, it is. Yeah, because that was verified. So you never really know who's in your social corner or who's around or who you think is a friend or not a friend. I mean, there's always kind of eavesdropping on to some extent. I'm sure there'll be people looking at this video at some point if it gets garners a certain amount of views. But it became quite real. I never really felt threatened by it, though. I was quite interested about the whole topic of censorship and freedom of speech and stuff. And I would kind of push quite a lot in my lessons towards the line, and I'd be as objective as possible. I never really found myself in any trouble, but I was always very conscious of it. And I think most teachers are. You don't go out there and be stupid. You do try and toe the line to an extent. Otherwise, you're just going to make your life very difficult. But then it became very, I think, it affected. I noticed when I had more Chinese friends and Chinese girlfriend, and later became my fiance. They never seemed too bothered about it. Especially, and sometimes we would test things like on WeChat, we would send certain words or pictures in English as well. There's the famous one with Xi Jinping, who was characterized as Winnie the Pooh, and basically Weixin, which is WeChat, banned the word Winnie the Pooh. So we were lying together in bed and I said, I'll send this to you and see if you receive it on WeChat. And she didn't receive it. It was amazing, And so I was looking at all these hot censored words that were essentially blocked. And I tried, writing them, sending to them, and she just didn't receive the text messages. Like the algorithms or whatever the user were, seemed very efficient. And again, that was particularly because it was about political characters. So did you find, Trevor, that it's did it affect you personally? As a foreigner, can the censorship in China affect your day-to-day life? Does it make your life more difficult, or is it just non-consequential after a bit?
Really depends your motives of operation for your work and for your life, and if you need things like Google or social media, international social media, things like that, because you can use a VPN. A lot of VPNs will be, but you need to patch your VPN almost every month, which can be a burden. And there's just this constant cat and mouse kind of game that you'll have to be a part of. Otherwise, kind of like Lewis, what you were saying, it could be a good thing. I've stopped using Facebook even since coming back to the US. I don't miss it at all. It's just a time suck that I don't need in my life. But censorship, I think we can talk. I think there are real consequences and real negative consequences that because censorship is already the norm in China, then it goes beyond that. And not the official line, like the company line and other things. For example, from a personal anecdote, I attended a wedding once between a Chinese groom and an American bride, and I know their story. And the wedding was in northern China. It was in Shanxi, and it was remarkable to me to see. They had a very traditional wedding, but the next day, the talk amongst a lot of our friends was an article that came out in the provincial newspaper of Shanxi, which has probably over 10 million daily readership, for almost an entire half page of the newspaper. And keep in mind, I keep mentioning the newspaper magazines because a lot of older, like 30 years and older, read paper. They read print.
Yeah.
You know, that is still very common. That's where most people get their official information, written by journalists. They do not get it from online as much, although that's somewhat changing and different for younger people. So in this 10 million day readership is a story about how they met, which is entirely, from the date they met, from their jobs, from how they met, from their future plans, is entirely fabricated. And it was done by the mother-in-law, the mother of the groom, the Chinese mother-in-law. We can talk about Chinese in-laws at a later point.
Yeah.
But this is a unique and quite extreme situation in which it's no longer just about censorship, but the control of information and factual information and truthful information, which people are saying a lot of social media and the international is a problem. The reality is once you start censoring, well, then all information becomes a matter of perspective, and that all of the facts can be changed, especially if they're not harming anyone. You know, no one really cares. No one's met this couple before in the province of Shanxi. But to our friends, it's like, well, where's the honesty? Where's the integrity? What's the even purpose of writing this entire article that is not true? And that, to me, is an indirect consequence of the control of information, the obvious, the explicit, and the socially acknowledged control of information. That if the government can control this, well, then we can control the entire narrative to our family's story. We fabricate it all. So that's kind of one anecdote that, to me, is a real risk. That you just can't trust any information, despite the journalist, despite the truth of where it's coming from. Because, like, you guys, you must know there's sources that you trust for information and sources that you just automatically know are spin or even misinformation. But you can't know that in China. There is zero real, true, factual source of information in China. And that is the risk of censorship. So I don't know, Lewis.
I would actually have to respectfully disagree with you on that, because I think in some ways, like, when you know what the official line is, what the government line is, what the political line is, that you can't talk about certain subjects, certain things are going to be censored, everybody knows that that's the case. And so you can start to almost kind of compensate for that when you're reading the news. You know that, okay, yeah. I remember I hadn't been in China very long, and there was like a crash with one of the high-speed trains, like the Gaotie. And like, apparently the official figures reported that it was like 30-something people who had died.
Yeah.
And all of my Chinese friends laughed and said, oh yeah, they have to say that it's less than 40. Otherwise it goes up from being handled on a provincial level to, I'm not sure exactly, but basically it's seen as a more serious case if over a certain number of people die. So then they're kind of like laughing, saying, oh yeah, whenever there's like an accident like this, it's always less than 40 people that die. It's always like 30-something, because then it causes less trouble politically or something. And like, I mean, whether that's true or not, I guess isn't the point. But the point is that they can automatically start to compensate for this, because they know that there's the official government line, or things have been censored in a certain way. But when you have completely open information on something like YouTube, where anybody can upload a video of anything, and you don't know what their what their stance is, you don't know what their bias is, it's much more difficult to compensate for. So actually, I think in some ways having a sort of strong government censorship it means that you can at least know that you can't trust anything, which is more than a lot of people do, where they think they can trust stuff when actually they can't.
It kind of draws a line, right? So it's like, right, I know you're presenting me with this information, so at least I know this information is not true, right? And then you start looking around it. It's kind of like you have to look in the mirror. You know, you're always gauging the reflection. Yeah, I mean, and it can be quite funny. You know, I think after a couple of years in China, when there was certain you know, things going around or how things operate, you know, I mean, a bit about the nationalism as well, because this crosses over into censorship, how they present things different to the rest of the world, like the Olympics table, because the last Olympics 2016, Britain actually finished second on the table because we received more gold medals and silver medals than China. But for that Olympics, China decided that the total amount of medals would quantify who finishes second. So they kind of, on their table, they put themselves above the UK, which is, you know, just funny. I didn't actually take offense to it at all. It's kind of adolescent in a way. Do you know what I mean? It's like kind of a teenager stomping its feet, and some of it can get a bit more sinister. And but yeah, when the trouble is in the West with YouTube, Facebook, we've got, shall we say, too much truth. It's diluted, right? And this is what I agree with some of the Chinese students. When you give everyone a voice, you know, truth becomes meaningless. We don't know, you know, there's equal amounts of theory to anything that you can find an opposite answer to anything that's given by the BBC on YouTube. Anyone can disagree with anyone. There's kind of, you end up with just a lot of talking heads, a lot of people, you know, screaming at each other. And I think that's one thing that China has been keen to avoid. And they would say that they have avoided that to great success and created social stability. And I think the more that the West moves on this path with every voice counts, you know, China's going to go in the opposite direction to just say one voice counts. So it's quite polarized. So really, we have to look at the benefits of, you know, what benefits is it to society with giving everyone a voice, and the benefits of free speech, and is it more beneficial to have censorship and one voice in a country? Trevor, where do you stand on because you're an American, right? You are. You still consider yourself an American, Trevor?
I haven't revoked my passport yet. But.
Right. But I mean, for America, you know, free speech, it's you know, officially the only country in the world with genuine free speech. We think we have it in the UK, but we don't. There are laws to prevent us from speaking free. We have laws about hate speech and so forth. And then we have all this stuff about gendered pronouns across the world, especially in Canada. But America, you know, because of how it's founded in the Constitution, free speech is massively important. So are you still a big advocate of free speech, or have you relented somewhat and seen the benefits of maybe people zipping their mouths?
Free speech is a tired and over simplified black and white kind of issue. But I would say that more than free speech, I am definitely unequivocally in support of the freedom of information and the pursuit of truth, as in the pursuit of happiness. So in that sense, yeah, again, we have to continue this this discussion in a kind of in a way from both perspectives. So if you're saying that there is an official line, right, then that official line, it has consistency. And let's say in China, there is a lot of consistency for publications and for social media. And in the US, there's very little consistency with social media, but at least with publications, you know, not everyone has a voice. Not everyone can get published in the BBC or in Reuters or in any, what you would in the UK consider respectable journalistic outlet. It's not that simple. And the facts, the numbers, the places, the times, the occurrences, you know, that a lot of that does impact people's lives. We talk right now, we're in the coronavirus. We won't get too much in depth, but right now, more than ever, having official factual information and useful information on how to protect yourself and those you love is very important. And I'm not saying that China is not withholding how to protect yourselves during this time, but the potential would be there if the official line is not in the interest of that. And in the US, going back to freedom of speech, I think it's more really about freedom of press and freedom of information, which are really essential. And Milton Keynes said himself, there should be a somewhat, a regulated transfer of goods, of a somewhat regulated.
Keynes or Friedman?
Was it Friedman? Yeah,
Milton Friedman.
Yeah, maybe it was Milton Friedman.
I think it's freedom. Yeah, but I do think that freedom of speech goes hand in hand with freedom of information, because, you know, ultimately we're still putting in this yardstick saying, well, what is the truth? And, you know, there are grey areas, and right. People are still free to believe anything that they want to believe. If you want to believe David Icke, you can. You know, if you want to be a Mormon, you can, because the freedom of speech also is related to religion, and China being a secular country, you know, a strong secular country, their religion is money at the moment, basically. So, you know, they don't miss it. Look, in my experience, I really don't think your average Chinese person cares about freedom of speech, and I think they know about censorship, and they don't particularly care about it. They're still in this economic bubble of trying to achieve middle class status in a very competitive cities, and they're just distracted by things that people are distracted by: TV shows, cartoons, buying a Gucci handbag or whatever. I've only met a handful of quite idealistic Chinese people who really offered discontent about being censored. And these people were actually quite wealthy. They'd already achieved middle class status. They had businesses. They traveled a lot all over the world. They were looking to you know, move capital out of China as well. But, you know, that's a small little handful. And I think most people just get on with it. I mean, have you guys ever met, I mean, obviously we can't go into detail, but it's not like people are really talking about what they can't talk about in China. I think they know the lines, and they just adapt accordingly. It doesn't affect their standard of living, basically. Lewis.
What do you think, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that largely I kind of agree with what John said about most of the Chinese people that I speak to, that I've met. They're more interested in pursuing, you know, wealth and paying off their mortgage and buying a car and those things. But I think that might just be more result of the Chinese people that we're meeting in the situation where we are. You're living in a big developed city. In other areas of China, other situations where, you know, we're not meeting these people, there might be more of a concern for that. I know there was quite recently, there was like an independent documentary maker who was trying to distribute their documentary on the I think it was like the like mining industry or something in the north of China, and obviously they like weren't able to distribute it legally. I think they had to like so like actually just asking people to watch it, not even like making any money from the documentary through like online and stuff. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of maybe disgruntled miners that might be upset that their you know, their lack of you know, or the censorship surrounding their sort of situation where they're being heard. Those people might be you know, might be not happy with that. But obviously we're not going to meet those kind of people if you're living in Shanghai, or you're living in Guangzhou,
yeah.
Or living in Hangzhou, you're living in a top tier city, especially if you're like teaching EFL, or if you're working, as you say, like you're working for an international company and you're in your bubble where you don't even meet many Chinese people at all necessarily. So yeah, I think I think it's difficult to make a generalization on what Chinese people do and don't feel towards a certain issue when I think our experience is quite limited to a certain sort economic sort of demographic of the Chinese population.
Yeah, but I mean, the cities are important, and ultimately that is kind of the aspiration. So a city like Hangzhou or a tier 2, tier 1 city is really kind of the template that the government want to set for the rest of the country. Looking back at it, I also think it's fair to say that there are more protests about especially localized things than people realize. They just never spread nationally because they're contained through censorship and heavy-handing police.
They're all about workers' rights, I remember in Hangzhou there were several protests about the construction of incineration plants.
Yeah, and that actually got quite big at one point. And going back to your story about the train crash in Wenzhou, I think that did have protests, and it did go to national level because the head of the railway, he was executed. I think they sentenced him to death.
Yeah.
In the end,
it's a lot bigger than people realize, because what the unofficial story is that a train, there was 2 trains on the same track, and one was stopped at a station and the other just went through it. So obviously the tragedy was far beyond what was reported. There was a lot of upset people in Wenzhou and throughout China that were directly impacted by this. And I won't say that the information going nationally or internationally about the actual death toll or the actual cause of the event would have changed, but it definitely, I mean, it's an internal lesson learned, right?
Well, you'd like to think so, yeah. But I mean, this brings us to really the current situation, which I suppose we can come on to a bit. But I mean, again, it's the system how it works in China as well, because it's top down, but also when incidents happen provincially, a lot of these people, they're just trying to cover their own backs, because if something goes to Beijing, it's a big red flag for them. They want to keep it, some of them want to keep it hidden from Beijing because they know they're in big trouble, right? And this could well explain certain areas of what happened in Wuhan, going back in November, is that it's suppressed at provincial level in order for those guys to try and clean up to stop Big Daddy knowing in Beijing. I suspect that this might have been the case with the COVID outbreak originally in Wuhan. So I do have some sympathy, shall we say, with the government in that case, because they were probably behind the curve on it because of the actions of people at provincial level. But either way, they could be used as an excuse for it as well.
There's no telling that if it was any other city in China or in the world, that the same thing wouldn't have happened. Yeah,
that's true, because everyone wants to cover their backs at the end of the day, and maybe the systems that are in place make it it can encourage secrecy, but then also some of the systems in place can encourage a quick response. As far as when we talk about censorship, then we have to really just say, right, look, the information coming out of China at the minute regarding COVID, okay, because basically there's accusations of them, a big cover-up. People say it's unbelievable. Conspiracy theorists from anything from biological weapons, the Wuhan lab. The official line is the seafood market in Wuhan. I mean, Lewis, what do you particularly care? Do you think it makes much difference, or are you just because we're still in the middle of it in the UK, so I think we're just dealing with it day by day as it comes. But I mean, how much of the information do you think is censored, and why?
You mean about the origins of?
Well, let's just look at the figures. Yeah, so say the origins, the response, I think,
going back to what I said before, it's like, after you've been in China a long time, there's certain things that you just learn to suspect when they're in the Chinese media, and statistics on, number of people that died is just one thing that you always take with a pinch of salt, or at least, that's my understanding. I think if you, to ask most Chinese people, do they completely trust how many the exact figures on how many people have died? Then I think a lot of them would probably not. I don't know. It seems like for most, from most of the Chinese people I've spoken to, they have more trust in the central government than the provincial government.
Yeah,
they think the provincial government likes them, but if you can get it past the provincial government, if you can go up that step on the ladder, and there are certain ways they can do that as well. They can kind of like bypass certain levels on the system and report things higher up. Then they think that they can trust the central government. That's
true. I agree with that. It's something I noticed in the last 18 months is actually there's a lot more trust towards Beijing, and they seem to think the dirty hands are always closer to home. Whether the main reason behind that is because they're trying to leapfrog, because they're trying to power grab themselves, I don't know. But I think overall, yeah, there does seem to be more trust when the information comes from Beijing.
I'll add to that. There is a lack of criticism that's tolerated towards the central government in China versus provincial or municipal governments. That's for sure as well, and you can see that directly from the coronavirus.
Mm. Yeah, I mean the provincial can be the fool guys when they need them to be. I mean, Trevor, where do you stand then on this? Do you think that the censorship hand has been overworking during COVID, or do you think that the Chinese have had a bit of a rough stick? Some unnecessary flack from the rest of the world.
It was like 3 days of going through my WeChat, which were unforgettable, about the cultural contrast and some of the complexity and it was one day when I think it was the first day, January 24th of 2020. There was at this point Wuhan and most of Hubei was already on complete lockdown, and most of my WeChat feed was all about potentially useful information about the importance of staying at home, the importance of protecting yourself, wearing masks, all these things, quite factual. And the message was all official articles. And it seemed that this massive wave of information on the severity of it, the importance of it, and how to deal with it in your own world was quite positive. There was also some pretty graphic and sad stories going around, and those ones ended up getting censored and deleted later. And finally, the next day, I think maybe it was the day after, it was Kobe Bryant passed away tragically in the helicopter, and there was an entire feed of people grieving.
Yeah.
And then the third day after that, it all went back to COVID information and what was happening around China and some of the numbers that were being reported of cases and deaths and things like that, to see that this is not a Wuhan problem. It's definitely a national problem.
Yeah.
That was about a week after it started to be really widely reported upon. So I don't know if it's necessarily a good or bad thing, but the public information during a time of which most of China just shuts down, there was a lot of good information available about this, and there was definitely missing information. There was a lack of criticism, a lack of speculation and call for investigation on how this started and why this wasn't reported. And the third thing I forgot to mention was the passing of the doctor Li Wenliang.
Yeah, that was crazy. That
was the same week. And it was the grieving of him. And I don't know, John, do you want to talk about who Li Wenliang is? And
well, you've put in two important points there, because the Kobe Bryant, I think it's difficult to undersell how big Kobe Bryant was in China. Basketball, the NBA is huge. People think that the Premiership and football, not America, is big in China. It's not. It really, it's big, but it's not massive compared to the NBA. And the outpouring of grief was one of the biggest things I've ever seen on WeChat. And it came at the start of the COVID outbreak. So there was a lot of fear and everyone was very tentative anyway. And the death of Kobe kind of played into that. So people were very kind of scared and emotional anyway. And then you've got the government giving this quite very clear, concise information to everyone. And they can spread the information very quick. and everyone was very compliant. And, you know, Chinese, and I don't mean this as a derogative, it's going to sound derogative, but I don't want it to be, is that Chinese people can be very scared. They can kind of scare easily, you know. They're very cautious, shall we put it that way. It's like they kind of operate under caution. The idea of like gung-ho bravery isn't really ingrained in Chinese culture. It's very rare that you kind of meet a swinging dick, gunslinging kind of me against the world Chinese person. You know what I mean, right? It's like they're all very compliant, and with compliance, one of the best ways is to operate under fear, but it has uses, you know. They took it all very seriously. But when it came to Dr. Lee, it kind of like had these stages of grieving, of emotion. Like they were scared, and then they were sad over Kobe. And then when Dr. Lee died, they got angry. It's kind of the classic stages, you know, of grieving. And I actually thought at that point that there was going to be a big backlash, because people were generally angry with Dr. Lee. There was people were kind of saying things that I wouldn't think they would usually say. They were raising questions, and it just fizzled out. Like the next day, it had gone. There was a little bit, but then it had gone. And, you know, I'd speaking to some people in China, and they just say, yeah, you know, but we've just got to get on with things now. There's no point in rocking the boat now or asking difficult questions. We've just got to kind of get on with it and try and get back to normal. So, you know, there was kind of, I think it was a bit of a unique time overall with those three important things that you're right to bring them up. Where do you think about while we're on the COVID and the censorship, I think one of the big questions is Chinese New Year. Is that, do you think the CCP had a choice to ban travel before Chinese New Year? Because I think retrospectively, when we do investigate, when we do look at things, because I think there will be some kind of commission involved, there will be an international, I think the Chinese will allow some kind of international investigation. And I think that might be a sticking point. Do you think that they had the choice where they could have closed down travel for Spring Festival, Lewis? Or do you think that would have led to massive social unrest? Do you think that would have been dangerous for them to stop?
I don't think I'm really in a position to judge that. I mean, like I said, my experience with Chinese people is that they're very, you know, they can be very compliant. But I mean, as previously mentioned, that's, you know, my experience in a certain area of China with a certain demographic of the population. So I don't know if you had, you know, migrant workers, you know, from rural areas that are told they can't go back. I think, you know, that's more likely to be the demographic of the population that would get most angry by that. I think, you know, the reasonably wealthy middle class, like you pointed out, so like can be quite compliant, and their main aim is just, you know, can I pay off my mortgage? Can I get a car? Can I go shopping at the weekend?
Yeah. How about you, Trevor? Did you, because when all this was kicking, it was really taking off round about the Chinese New Year, and there was talk. I remember a little bit of talk because I was talking to my fiance at the time, because she couldn't go back at home, and I can't disclose, but her job is in a position where she's involved in a lot of transport, and she kind of knew what was going on with the planes and so forth. And she said that there was rumors that they were going to tighten or maybe restrict before, but they allowed those kind of three or 4 days of mass migration to happen.
Yeah, that's a sensitive topic. I think it's a double-edged sword, and you got to really play the devil advocate, which is, yeah, clearly the stopping the flow of people would have hypothetically slowed, not stopped. I think by Chinese New Year, containment was beyond. It was no longer a possibility. The nature was going to take its course. That's just how viruses kind of work. So from my understanding of what different epidemiologists and different doctors have said, so it would have slowed and given more time for countries around the world to prepare essentially for mitigation and potential containment. However, coming from the American perspective, there was 2 months of which the U.S. had been briefed, Congress and a lot of people in the U.S. had been briefed, and what was done in those 2 months, I mean, nothing essentially. And at the same time, going back to, there was so little known in Wuhan about the nature of the virus, its spread, its case fatality rate, all these things. It's just so hard to say what we'd be in a different situation, but how different would it be? It just becomes very, very.
I think, irrespective of the nature of the virus, because we're not medical experts or epidemiologists, but I mean, we can have a talk on that, maybe in another topic, go into it more detail. But I think probably the parties or the powers that be did have that decision, and they did think about it. And I have great sympathy why they didn't stop it. And this is my thinking on it, is that Chinese New Year is really one of the only times that if you look at crime statistics in China, particularly the cities in the tier 2 cities, tier 1, there's virtually no crime in China. So certainly no violent crime, shall we say. There's fraud and things and sneaky crime, bike theft, things like that. But confrontational crime, it's really disappearing. And that's a lot of the measures that they've introduced. But if you look at when crime does occur, it's usually just before Chinese New Year. Right. And this is because a lot of people are desperate to get back. It's the one time of the year that people are going to risk ignoring authority. It's the one time when if they want to get back home to see their family, because a lot of these migrant workers, they work all year, it's so important to them. They will quit their jobs in the city and not come back. And I think that if they did ban travel, I think a large portion would have ignored it anyway. I think that there could have been social unrest at train stations, not the airports, because that's the middle class flying. I think the train stations would have really struggled, maybe been overwhelmed. They might have lost control of the situation. So I actually have great sympathy if it does come back that they were faced with this dilemma whether to stop travel for Chinese New Year or not. I perfectly understand why they did. And I think it's probably in the interest, not just of the party, but also in the interest of the country, stability, that it happens, Imagine banning Christmas on Christmas Eve for everyone in the UK. People just would not do it. People would just go, fuck you, we're going to the pub, It's just no chance. And even as compliant as the Chinese are, I think that would have pushed them. I think that would have been a button that could have led to unrest. I don't know. What do you think, Lewis? Do you think that's a bit far?
Well, I think we've definitely gone a bit off the topic of censorship, but
yeah.
Like and as you said, I mean, none of us are experts on this. I'm just throwing my thoughts out here. But most of the migration during Chinese New Year is from densely populated urban areas to sparsely populated rural areas. So, if you then lock people down in less densely populated rural areas, surely that's going to, I mean, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but maybe that's going to actually slow the spread of a virus more than if you lock them down in really densely populated megacities.
Well, it would take the pressure off the hospitals as well, the larger hospitals in the cities. Whether they thought about that, who knows? But I mean,
getting back to censorship.
Let's get back to it.
Yeah.
You two are both being quite sympathetic towards the Great Firewall and the general censorship and control of information in China. Is there really nothing detrimental? There's no customs that you see through this censorship machine, whether directly or indirectly.
Oh yeah, definitely. So this is the main point, right? Like, I can sympathise with it, because there are, especially when you come back to the UK and you just see people squawking and just venting their own voice. But the thing is, out of those dissenting voices is where creativity starts. And this is one of China's big problems, is that it lacks the creativity, and you get creativity through destruction, through dissent, through kind of pushing at boundaries. That's how something new is born, right? New ideas, whether it's war, whether it's whether it's finding a cure for a disease. It kind of pushes the envelope all the time. And I think that you will find that in China, because of the censorship, there's just going to be this lack of progression when it comes to innovation, because it does struggle, China, with innovation. It's heavy on copying. It's brilliant at copying anything it wants to do. But when it comes to being a market leader, or truly leading the world in new thoughts, in new directions, it's just way off the pace. It's a follower. And I think one of the advantages of having freedom of speech, freedom of information, and dissenting voices is that you, from the ashes, you do arise. You occasionally get these great ideas that flourish, and push societies forward. And I don't see that in China. I don't see that in the education system. I don't see it because the education system is very censored as well, which overlaps into the propaganda. But it's a struggle. I mean, I have to admit, it's a struggle in the UK with media going onto Twitter, listening. Everyone's an expert. Everyone's bickering, and it's hard to find out what the truth is in any way. And one more thing I add to it as well is that the Chinese are very clever about this, as are the Russians, and they know that in the West that we value this freedom of speech and this social media platforms, and they are using it to spread discord. That there are many bots out there, and it's been proven now. That foreign entities, which are China and Russia, basically, they're encouraging this kind of divide and rule mentality of sowing discord. You've got Russians joining fracking groups, anti-fracking groups in the UK to spread information about how bad fracking is. Well, one of the big losers of fracking would be the Russian government. So it's perfectly in their interest if they can sow discord about fracking. And they are very smart the way they do it. So they're playing the game, and we can't play that game back to them because of their censorship. Well, that's where I'm at anyway with it at the moment.
And you, Lewis, I'm just trying to be the devil's advocate here.
I think I do have criticisms of China, but I think it's not the censorship in itself, particularly when we're talking about online censorship and stopping the spread of false information. I think it's more things that John just mentioned, like the education system and propaganda, and I think that's more. But I actually think the actual censorship and the way they handle misinformation online or restrict information online, I think it's actually I don't have any problems with it. I actually think that maybe we would benefit with a bit more of that. Like if we did that, then we certainly wouldn't have it. Like John said, it wouldn't open the door to foreign countries.
It doesn't bother you that no one in China is going to see this very informational, well put together video?
I can't accept that, Lewis. I have to say that I think when it comes to the crunch, you have to use one of the unfortunate byproducts or yardsticks of freedom is to have disagreements, to have people getting led down different paths, to have bickering. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's a price I'm willing to pay. I'm not.
But the thing is, like you said earlier, that we don't have complete freedom of speech in the UK anyway. And I mean, the fact is that we do have censorship. There are things that you can't say, or things that will be removed on if you put them on YouTube or on Facebook. But who is it that's regulating them? Is it the government, or is it those companies? And who would you trust more? Would you trust your government more, or would you trust a company more to regulate the information, censor it? And also, if it is the government, as going back to what I said earlier, you can kind of compensate for that. You can say, okay, well, I know it's the government censoring this, so there's a chance that actually, we're missing some information here. But when it's a company, you don't necessarily always know where they stand.
That is true, and a lot of this is going to stem, which is another topic, is like woke culture and social justice warriors, which the media companies in the West are very left leaning, and that a lot of their censorship is to do with language, political correctness, and things like that, rather than actual politics and shall we say, sensitive information. And they tend to self-censorship because they want to protect the vulnerable, or they don't want people to be offended. None of that type of censorship does not exist in China. I'm sure we can talk about China and woke culture and social justice. That stuff just doesn't exist over there. They don't really give a fuck about it, to be honest. And it's a different kind of censorship that the media companies are doing.
I mean, we have talked about like political censorship, but also just going back to I guess experiences. I did at one point subscribe to it was like a WeChat official account for it was like gym trainers or something, and they had articles. I just mainly read it because I built up a lot of Chinese vocabulary reading that relate to the gym, reading these things. But there was one article that had been posted that said, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something along the lines of you've been lied to by pharmaceutical companies about diabetes, and it's just because you don't exercise enough or something. And I was like, I remember reading the title and thinking like, what's that about? So I clicked on it, and it just came up with, I couldn't get onto the article, but it comes up with like a little sort of like, it's been crossed out with a red line over the title of the article, and it says not real information, like whoosh, and then it's got underneath, and it says has been reported as misinformation by this person, and it was like a doctor. And then underneath it had the whole refutation of why this was not real factual information, that this doctor, and it had like, you could actually click on it and see who it was that had actually refuted it. Somebody with some authority, medical authority, had refuted this article, and then it had been blocked for that reason, and you could read why. And like that, I don't know, does Facebook do that? I've never seen that on Facebook.
Yeah, they've started to, and the BBC have started to do that now, take things from the social media. But I mean, it comes to the point, it's like, yeah, that was probably a fake article, and there are things around, but at the same time, we have to get to a point where it's either you have to entrust people to have their own judgment, or equip your kids with a good perspective of life, where they can, find the bullshit or walk between the bullshit, or you're just going to thought police everyone. But so you're saying that's a good thing. You are happy with that?
I think online it's a good thing, but I see how, and I mean, when combined with an education system that doesn't necessarily encourage people to think critically, then it can, I guess it could lead to some problems where people, like you say, aren't thinking critically, and like you say, they're sort of being I'm not sure if thought policed is really the right word, but I think certainly with in relation to some like sort of political stuff, then it does it does encourage people to not really be thinking. But I think in relation to a lot of other stuff that's like misinformation, fake information, I think it's very useful, because when you go on, and it doesn't matter how critically you're able to think, when you go online and there's just so much misinformation, it's often wrapped up in a very convincing way.
Yeah.
And sometimes there'll be outright lies. You can read an article on on social media over here, and there can just be outright lies about this expert said this, and actually that expert didn't say that at all. People just lie, and it's very convincing.
It's a convincing word salad. People have got, linguistically, people have got quite good on the internet, making things sound convincing, full of conviction, throwing this word salad around, and a lot of people buy into it. You have to be quite well versed and and experienced, and just, you know, it's very difficult. You know, I do feel sorry for a lot of the kids growing up through this swamp of bullshit. You know, and to that extent, then yeah, you know, having an overarching power that's willing to censor and create one line to walk might be beneficial. But I think it comes to the point with China is that the only true censorship they do care about is political. You know, anything that, you know, articles on diabetes, that's fair enough. They're willing to kind of unearth truth and say, well, if you start talking about history or political history or questioning certain policies or you know, presenting sound evidence about certain things in history or even political things in the present, that is not going to that's not going to get through the filters. That's not going to come through the
but like you said, John, most Chinese people aren't really thinking about that anyway. So in China, it's not really an issue. And in Britain, you know, like if you had that kind of censorship, people would still be thinking about it and talking about it down the pub. You know, if we're just talking about restricting what can be put online, I don't think it would have such a negative effect on people's ability to criticize and talk shit about the government in our country anyway.
That is true, and it might actually even direct the conversation a bit more that way. Yeah, look, I think it's all the slippery slope. It's difficult, but
and this is what I talked about: slippery and down the slope. And like both of you mentioned two things, which I kind of wanted to make one of my last points, which was, yeah, Lewis, you talked about like companies controlling information and self-regulating and or doing regulation versus the government, and obviously the company would be much more, it's in along with their corporate goals, obviously, which become an issue. And John, you said that Chinese aren't creative, which I think what you're talking about is more critically thinking, but the reality is that Chinese are quite creative when they come to problem solving, meaning so long as you can get a result, the means of getting there become quite flexible. And when you look at the recent issue of, for example, Luckin Coffee, you know, and a company that so blatantly controlled its own revenue streams and is required by law in China and in the US to report accurately and honest information on its, well, sales and its promotions and its revenue and its costs and expenses. As soon as you start fabricating that, well, then you're directly impacting people that invest in Luckin and the employees that are dependent on the company being responsible for its honest business ethics maintenance. But the clear reasons of doing that are that the results are to get the stock prices as high as possible and to make the sales as high as possible. And we can even go further into saying the GDP, for example. Every year, if you combine all of the GDP that the provincial governments report, it's drastically higher than what the national government reports. And all of this information is quite important when you look into getting into policy, economic policy, and getting into all of this and this blatant control of information that, well, if the government can do it, well, then the central government can do it, well, then the municipal government can do it, well, then this company can do it, and then actual, true, verifiable information on economic performance, which we can talk in a whole nother
that's going to be a big topic,
is important, and it impacts people's livelihoods. And if it hasn't already, it will continue to more in the future. So this is something later down the road, and you can argue that the control of political information doesn't directly result in this, but certainly the control of information is the underlying principle, and that not only is it tolerated, it's expected. Everyone knows that Chinese companies, whether you're the biggest, I don't know, would that be Alibaba or China Petrol or one of these countries? That you have multiple sets of auditing books, one for auditors, one for internal use. And this is uniquely Chinese. It's not even overseas Chinese. It's not. This is a mainland Chinese thing, and you have to. It's correlative here. Understand that comes from this understanding that you can control, publish what should be verified, trusted information on, irregardless of that. Going back to the wedding story that I said, and going back to other published information, that because control of information is allowed, there is so much people take information as being true when it's actually just completely falsified.
Well,
that's what my bottom line would be.
Yeah, Trevor, what you're saying is essentially lying, and I think we'd look at the economics. That's going to be a whole nother story. But yeah, there are big problems there, and the idea of transparency and access to correct information, that's a hornet's nest that many people really don't understand. They, like, a lot of the West are turning a blind eye to. But that's not creativity. When I'm talking about creativity, it's not to be creative with numbers and accountancy, because I'm happy to admit that China is probably the most creative country in the world when it comes to accountancy and figures. I've got no hesitation about saying that. But I'm talking about innovation and creativity from challenging ideas, challenging the status quo. That's how you get progress. You don't progress by maintaining persistent status quo without it at least being pushed a little bit. And most societies benefit from that in the long run. History proves that, not just modern history, but ancient history. So I think you have to accept a little bit of it in your society. You have to accept that every so often you're going to get water splashing the boat, and you just, hopefully it comes to some good use. What was my last point? Lewis, do you want to finish off while I try and think of my last point?
Yeah. I think I sort of covered pretty much everything I had to say on the topic, but I think I think overall, like, sort of just looking specific, what I'm thinking of is just specifically controlling information on social media sites and who is able to just post information that's out there in the public for everybody to read. But what you guys talking about more like sort of like censorship of political information, and also, when it goes onto the economic side of things, where sort of like governments are like sort of censoring actually their own kind of like economic information. I guess that could have some very I'm sure that can have some very serious consequences.
I think that, okay, my last point would be a case of perception, because I do think that we're going to enter a shall we say, a crisis of perception at the moment with China and the rest of the world. We are looking a bit polarized. Kind of opinion on the street is not really favorable. Some of it's kind of a bit unnecessary, I think. But one of the only ways you can remedy this is through trust. Trust is really key, whether it's in business or any form of relationship. And I think there's always going to be big question marks over trust, as far as, with having separate internets, having, things becoming more segregated, more heavy-handed censorship. This could continue to erode the trust, and that's not a good thing. So maybe there has to be some kind of meeting of halfway, or some kind of transparency. I am a big believer in transparency, because I think ultimately it's good for business. I think it's good for people, and business and trade is what creates peace. If people aren't trading, and if people aren't increasing their standard of living, most often in history people are fighting. Cities are being destroyed, not built. So, that's where I sign out, is that I do think maybe the censorship in China, I understand it. I would like to see less of it, because I think it would be like an olive branch to the world, and I think it would create more trust and transparency. Trevor?
We'll talk more about this in the future, but I think we touched on this in the last episode, and you mentioned this plenty of times, propaganda and nationalism, and how censorship is feeding into that, the potential.
I think we need to talk about that. Sorry.
But,
I think we can go on to this in next, because the propaganda and the censorship are directly related. They're kind of like two arms of the same body.
And as it is the control of misinformation, obviously China has an advantage there with avoiding superstitious, potentially harmful and or misleading information, and it's not all bad. And even the cover-ups are somewhat shameful to cover up, because no one wants to take responsibility and a lack of accountability, but it's also not directly impacting most people who are not infected or not impacted by this, like we talked about in Wenzhou. But it certainly doesn't support the victims of those who did suffer directly from that kind of tragedy. So it's a tough topic. We can revisit it at another time, but I think we did a pretty good job of covering all the corners and disagreeing that there are pros and cons to it.
There are pros. I think we can agree that there are definitely pros and cons to this side. I think some of us kind of a bit on one side of the fence, maybe some on the other. But yeah, next week let's look a bit more into the propaganda and go into a bit more detail, because I do think a lot of the general public, I mean in China as well, aren't really aware of just how clever it is. You know, it's very subtle these days. It's very smart, and it's you know, it's not just small, it's big. It's a big business. All right, guys, anything else to add?
No, good here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look forward to propaganda next week.
Okay, next week then. All right, I'm going to sign off then. Bye-bye.